well, the Mad Lads have done it. In a move that has taken the world by surprise, including the American DoD as far as we know, Ukraine invaded Russia, officially kicking off the Second Battle of Kursk. The first, if you're unaware, occurred all the way back in World War II. But why invade Russia instead of sending more forces to get your own land back? This is the largest incursion into Russian territory since the beginning of the war, and it's happening as both sides are brutally grinding away on the eastern front of Ukraine. Given that Ukraine is facing manpower shortages, supply shortages, and is struggling to hold ground against Russian offenses, conducting a deliberate offensive into Russian territory was not necessarily on my 2024 bingo card. It brings up a lot of questions though. Why not reinforce the defensive lines? Why choose Kursk specifically instead of some other location? What are they looking to gain here? Is it all just a distraction for something else? Is this another Wagner-style march towards Moscow? I just want to preface this by saying I wrote this on the 11th of August, so by the time it actually goes live, Zelensky might have just tweeted out all the answers to these questions already, so just keep that in mind. Also, the information on this is spotty in some areas, and different sources are reporting different things, so I'll mostly be talking in broad strokes here because details are a bit fuzzy. So, August 6th, 2024. Ukraine launches an assault into Kursk off their northern border. The Ukrainian forces were deployed from the Sumy region, but one thing about this was interesting. See, this hasn't been the first border crossing of forces from Ukraine into Russia. In 2023, the Russian Volunteer Corps and the Freedom of Russia Legion, which are pro-Ukrainian paramilitary groups made up of Russian citizens, attacked into Russia 3 times, twice in 2023 and a third time in March of this year. The usefulness of these attacks have been largely minimal, and I don't say that in a condescending way. I was not the one with the cojones to invade Russia with only 2 battalions of militia volunteers, but the attack that happened just a few days ago wasn't done with one of these paramilitary organizations. One of the first things people started noticing was that the troops on the ground were standard Ukrainian soldiers, not volunteer militia and not special forces, just a bunch of Ivans and Vlads. Preliminary reports are saying that 4 different brigades were tasked with this attack. The decisive elements, to use a doctrinal term, are the 80th and 82nd separate air assault brigades, while the 2 supporting elements are the 22nd and 61st separate mechanized brigades. And these are pretty robust units. Each brigade is set up with organic armor, artillery, logistics, and engineer support, much in the same way that the United States does. Reports on how many actual Ukrainians are involved in this attack vary from just a few hundred to a few thousand. And if you consider that brigades generally have 1,000 people, that might give us an idea of how big this attack is. But at this point in the war, it's hard to determine what a brigade is actually made up of in terms of personnel, because if you count the casualties, that lower the number, and then any attachments they added on to raise the number, it can be a bit of a crapshoot. It also needs to be taken into account that there are without a doubt troops on the Ukrainian side of the border in support of this operation, specifically things like repair crews and higher level medical soldiers. This is reinforced by the videos we've been seeing of a few damaged Ukrainian vehicles being pulled by M88s to the rear. It might not seem important, but the actual makeup of the units sent on this attack give us a pretty good idea of maybe what they're going for, specifically the engineering vehicles. Vehicles used by combat engineers have 2 purposes: either clear paths for friendly troops to go through, or build stuff to make it harder for your enemy to take your ground. From what we're seeing, it looks like these are being used for the latter. Ukraine has already begun digging trenches and fortified positions in and around the 200 plus square mile kilometer area of seized territory, and this is what makes it a deliberate attack rather than a raid. Previous incursions over the border would fall more into the raid category, which is where you attack an area and then you leave. Deliberate attacks, however, you go in, you attack someplace, but then you stay. Conducting an attack to seize ground and then establishing a defense for a counterattack is like offensive 101. And as far as these attacks have been going, so far they've seemed to have been successful. Ukraine has taken some losses, but that's to be expected. So what is the goal here? Zelensky only acknowledged the incursion several days after it happened and defenses were already being dug in, but only confirmed that they did in fact happen and that they were done to disrupt the Russian military, which is just vague enough to not actually mean anything. There are several ideas as to why they would do this, and I want to dissect 4 of the bigger ones that I've seen and kind of get the logic behind them. First is that Ukraine is opting to try to seize the city of Kursk and the attached nuclear power plant. On paper, there is some credence to this argument. Ukraine has been sabotaging power infrastructure for a couple of weeks now in and around the region. Seizing the plant would not only be the logical next step in disrupting the Russian military's access to electricity, but also a very hard point for Russia to take back. It probably comes as no surprise that turning a nuclear power plant into a battlefield is not ideal. If Russia wanted to take it back, any assets like airstrikes or indirect artillery fire would run a massive risk of causing Chernobyl Part 2 inside of their own border. Nuclear power plants are relatively easy to defend because of how they're constructed, and Ukraine would be able to leverage all of its assets to anyone trying to approach it. But Russia would be largely limited to small arms fire because anything with an explosive warhead could trigger the inspiration for the next Fallout 4 mod pack. The thing is though, this isn't looking like it's super likely. Depending on the launching point, the Kursk power plant is 80 miles away from the Ukrainian border. The latest number of me writing this video reports that they're pushing about 18 miles in so far, and 62 miles is a massive distance you would need to cover. Yes, in theory, if you gunned it in a Humvee, you might get there in a couple hours if you miraculously don't get hit on the way there. But two things make this a very bad idea: supply lines and air defense. It's one thing to advance 80 miles with your line assault battalions, but it's a whole other monster to extend your vulnerable logistics 80 miles inside a territory that Putin is scrambling to take back with everything he has to spare. Just one intercepted convoy with ammo and supplies could be enough to doom a Ukrainian unit when fighting in Kursk starts to pick up. Second is air defense, and air defense assets essentially create bubbles around your troops to protect them. They're not perfect, and we have seen Russia hit a few targets here with aircraft, but the recently destroyed Havoc shows that they're doing a pretty damn good job. There's a big difference between Russia having air superiority over Kursk and then having total air supremacy. The digging of defensive lines shows that there is at least some intent to consolidate the gains they've made over the past week, and odds are they're not going to be digging a trench system that goes all the way to a nuclear power plant. That is, of course, unless we go back to the 17th century French siege warfare, which honestly I'd be cool with. We should bring back the classics. The second theory that you'll hear a lot is that Ukraine is trying to basically open up a second front to divert Russian offensive capabilities from the main line and then pull them into Kursk. Like the previous answer, there is good logic behind this. Russia over the past year or so has had to continuously rotate unit positions to cover down on areas where the attack has been slowing down. This is largely because they lack the infantry reserves to fill in those gaps, and instead have to spread out what forces they do have even further. This would also fall in line with the deep operation tactic used by both Ukraine and Russia, and this is basically having a massive front of smaller attacks until an opening is either found or made, and then once that happens, exploiting it with a penetration force. Just go ahead and get your laughs out now about me saying penetration force. Again, on paper, you would think that Russia would have to do that in order to account for Kursk, but they don't really have to. Russian law requires that conscripts remain inside the Russian border, meaning Russia has ample supply of personnel to throw at the Ukrainians. From what we've seen, they're not doing so well, but neither would I if I was forced to join the military. But luckily, my dumbass joined at 18. Don't have to worry about that. So while the troops that are responding to this counterattack aren't the best necessarily, there's still numbers that Ukraine has to deal with, and Russia can pretty much continue its offensive on the east line uninterrupted. It's true that Russia will be forced to shift some assets like aircraft and artillery to Kursk, but as of now, we haven't seen if it will be in numbers that make an actual difference across the main front line. A third reason for this that I've seen floating around is the psychological aspect of it all, because Russia, as of writing this, has had to evacuate almost 80,000 civilians. And by many accounts, the war in Ukraine has had negligible effects on the popular opinion by the main Russian population, or at least the population that Russia cares about. There is an undeniable psychological side to this, both negatively for Russia and positively for Ukraine, but I think this is more of a byproduct rather than the intent. There are much easier ways to change an enemy population's opinion of a war without risking 4 assault brigades to do it. The fourth and final angle that I'll be talking about is the political angle, essentially using this as a bargaining chip against Russia. Military gains are a sum-zero game. Every foot of ground you take is a foot your opponent loses. The occasional peace talk ideas we've seen floating around between both sides, first and foremost, revolve around what ground Russia would be willing to give back and what ground they'd be allowed to keep. The thing is, though, that despite Ukraine being the one invaded originally, they lack any real bargaining positions. Up until now, there's been nothing that they had that Russia would be willing to trade for captured territory. The seizure of territory inside of Russia's internationally recognized borders is something that they would probably be willing to give up Ukrainian territory for. This entire war is predicated on Russia taking Ukrainian territory. So if they lose territory that they had at the start of the war, that kind of puts the Russian land at a higher premium. Basically, and I'm just throwing numbers out there, for every square kilometer that Ukraine is able to seize, they'll get more than a square kilometer of land back. At least that's how the thinking goes. It's like traveling in the nether because it's faster than the overworld, and that was my appeal to the Gen Alpha audience because they're underrepresented right now. Ukraine is also seizing hundreds of POWs, which again is a win in their favor. The guys they're capturing are just border guards, not regular army troops. The guys that Russia have captured up until now have been actual troops, so again, Ukraine gets to bargain up for what they have. How this ends, I don't know. It will be interesting. As of me writing and making this video, Russia hasn't really been able to do anything to stop this advance. It's also going to be interesting to see how the United States responds to this. So far, Ukraine has not received the green light for the use of American-supplied ammunition like HIMARS rockets in this offensive, which we all know is a huge part of their overall military strategy. So what is the ultimate goal here? The people who need to know already know. But so far, whatever it is they're doing is working. I'll give more details as they occur, so make sure you subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.